Last night in New Hampshire, Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney rolled out a new stump speech. It was sort of an event unto itself. The New York Times describing the speech as carefully crafted, not just in its words, but in its atmosphere, noting the presence of special overhead lights and 2 teleprompters and 4 cameras from the Romney campaign on hand to film the scene. The new Mitt Romney stump speech both looked and sounded a lot like his probable template for a general election stump speech. The major theme being, of course, how awesome it would be if Mitt Romney were elected president in November instead of Barack Obama. So here it is. Here's the new general election-oriented, anti-Obama Mitt Romney for president trademark message.
4 years ago, many Americans trusted candidate Barack Obama when he promised to bring Americans together. But now we've learned that President Obama's idea of bringing us together is not to lift us up, but instead to use the invisible boot of government to bring us all down.
The invisible boot of government. If you put on an invisible boot, does that mean it will look like you are walking around barefoot, even though you are really not? I'm sure Mitt Romney means for the invisible boot of government to sound like something terrible, but it's kind of too weird to sound terrible, right? I mean, if anything, it sounds kind of neat. Maybe an invisible boot works like Wonder Woman's invisible plane. She's in a seated position, but why? Perhaps, you know, the invisible boot can also be controlled by telepathy. Mitt Romney is supposed to be scary big government metaphor. The invisible boot? It needs a little work. But if you can get past the whole invisible boot idea, the concept that Mitt Romney is getting at is a good one to debate, I think. And I mean that without sarcasm. He is getting at a core issue about the role of government and how we make things better, particularly in difficult economic times. This is about governance. And it's about governance decisions that are being made right now. Right now, we do have a Democratic president, and the Obama administration is making regulatory changes, including 2 big ones unveiled today, regulatory changes that matter. This is substantive stuff. This is not who's up and who's down. This is not just some symbolic thing to score points. This is real governing, right? The National Labor Relations Board is the subject of one of these new rules. They have passed a new rule as of today, which they've been debating for a very long time, which will change the rules by which people can decide they want to join a union. Right now, if enough people who work someplace are interested in there being a union there, and they get enough signatures to hold an election to decide about the union, one of the ways that businesses try to block the union from ever forming is by making it take forever between the time the workers say they want an election and the time the election actually happens. The new rules are designed to speed up that process. Also today, on air pollution, the Environmental Protection Agency has just released new rules to limit the amount of mercury and other toxins released into the air. The new standards will require coal and oil-fired power plants to make use of technology that is already out there to cut back emissions. The agency estimates that the new rules will prevent 11,000 premature deaths, 4,700 heart attacks, and 130,000 cases of childhood asthma every year. These new rules have been 2 decades in the making. They were unveiled today by EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson at the Children's National Medical Center. And I want to show you a little bit of what the rollout looked like. This is how the Obama administration rolled out this new rule and made the case for what they're doing here. I think this is substantively important to understanding what's going to happen next here.
This is a great victory for public health, especially for the health of our children. Before this rule, there were no national standards limiting the amount of mercury, arsenic, chromium, nickel, and acid gases that power plants across the country could release into the air we all breathe. When we talk about cutting hundreds of thousands of cases of respiratory symptoms, we're talking about young people who can go outside and be with their friends without the worry that they'll have to struggle to breathe. When we talk about reducing mercury levels in our environment, we're talking about lower amounts of mercury in the fish Americans eat each and every day.
Again, that was at a children's medical center. So that is how the Obama administration wants the country to understand this new rule. They rolled it out publicly with a pitch. Mitt Romney calls this new rule the invisible boot of government, which is a really ridiculous phrase, but it does get at a really important point. In the economy that we have, with the economic disparity that we have, with the middle class longing that we still have, even though we don't have much of a middle class anymore, from where we are now as Americans, do we look at changes like these? Changes like air pollution rules on mercury levels? Do we look at changes like making it not as hard to form a union where you work? Do we look at those changes and believe that those things are helping us as a country, or do we believe they are hurting? Not every American is going to answer that question the same way, but that is a good and substantive debate to have, whether or not we have to talk about invisible boots in order to do it. Joining us now is Bob Herbert, former columnist for the New York Times, currently a senior distinguished fellow at Demos and a contributor to PolicyShop.net. Mr. Herbert, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rachel. Do you know I'm wearing invisible boots right now, even as we speak?
I'm actually wearing an entire invisible fat suit.
He's unbelievable.
It's clearly this. I mean, the way they set it up, this clearly, it seemed like they were maybe shooting it for a TV ad. They want this to be the template for his moving forward. The invisible boot thing, I think, is inadvertently hilarious. But I'm sort of psyched by the overall message, because I feel like at least finally we can have a substantive debate about something that's about governance and not just elections and not just name calling.
Well, you know, he talks about the invisible boot and regulations and all that sort of thing. And, you know, it just makes me think the greatest period economically for our country and the time when the great middle class was created was that period from the late 40s to the mid-1970s. It was a period in which labor unions were very strong, taxes were much higher than they are now, regulations were much tighter. We had Glass-Steagall in the financial industry, for example, and things worked much better. It was when that began to unravel, starting in the mid-70s, coming all the way up to the 21st century, that things went haywire, and you see where we are now.
Are you happy, from the perspective of somebody who writes from a center-left perspective, are you happy that that would be the turf that the Republicans are staking, or at least this one leading Republican candidate is staking, for the big argument of the election? Oh,
yeah. I mean, this is a tough environment for Obama or any Democrat to win in any event. And the Republicans are just, from their perspective, fouling things up to fairly well. So you have someone like Romney talking about this invisible boot and talking about the need to get rid of regulations and that sort of thing, just emphasizing the fact that he is essentially for the 1%, to use the Occupy terminology. And then you have the crazies in the Tea Party in the House, for example, who are thwarting, at least until now, the extension of the tax decrease, the payroll tax decrease, and their whole goal is just to defeat Obama no matter who gets hurt. That combination is terrible for the Republicans.
Right now, as I'm thinking back on Mitt Romney's 2008 campaign, I was thinking back to his RNC speech at the convention. And that convention, of course, is remembered most for Drill Baby Drill, and of course for Sarah Palin's speech, which was political genius, even if it was a little bit weird in the moment. But Mitt Romney's speech is when he talked about, you know, taking an axe to regulations, taking an axe to red tape. He has always thought that, and a lot of Republicans have always thought that inveighing against regulation is a good thing, because it makes it sound like you're for businesses being let loose to grow and create more jobs. Do you think the politics of that changed because of the Wall Street collapse? Do you think the politics of that changed at all, or do you think that they can sort of still count on the political benefit of that the way they are?
I don't think they can count on the political benefit of that. I think that they are tone deaf when you start thinking about working Americans, whether they're middle class, whether they're poor, no matter where they are, as long as they're not the very wealthy. So if you start talking, I have never once in my life, traveling this country, interviewing ordinary people, never once heard anyone bring up the idea of regulations. They're not concerned about regulations. They're not concerned about taxes, for that matter. People don't think that they're too heavily taxed. They're concerned about the state of the economy. They're concerned first and foremost about jobs. But they're also concerned, and this is a little harder to quantify, they're concerned in a general way about what is happening to the country. There's still that streak of patriotism out there. They don't want the United States to fail, and they hate it when our alleged leaders in Washington are behaving the way they do. They can get nothing done, and they seem to be fouling things up to a fairly well.
On the issue of those National Labor Relations Board regulations, Republicans sort of stormed into 2011 thinking that going after union rights was going to be a real political winner for them, or at least it was going to be a real policy goal for them. We saw the huge, massive 100,000 people in the streets backlash to that in Wisconsin. We saw not only the backlash in the streets of Ohio, but we saw that bill recalled by Ohio voters after they did it there. I wonder if Republicans may be recalculating, or maybe ought to be recalculating what I'm sure they're planning on is being a full court press against this new rule. They've been very upset about that the NLRB might change this rule about unions.
Now, I don't know whether they're recalculating, but they ought to be, to use your words. I mean, I think what has happened is the Republicans have made hay for decades by pitting one group against another. And one of the saddest things I saw a couple of years ago was when ordinary working people who were not in unions were sort of making bitter comments about people who were in unions. Oh, they make too much. Oh, they have these pensions and I don't have a pension, and that sort of thing. But I think that has faded. And the Republicans are in danger now of really being perceived as attacking working people and attacking the middle class. And that's not a place where you want to be as you're entering a presidential election campaign.
Bob Herbert, thank you very much for joining us. It's nice to have you here. Merry Christmas, Bob.
Great to see you. You too.
All right. Next up, speaking of Christmas, why does